Hello, my loves, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds, and welcome back to the Narnia retrospectives. This is episode 4, I believe, in which we will be having a look at Prince Caspian, following on from The Horse and His Boy. This one won't be quite so vitriolic as the last one. In fact, this one's kind of like the antithesis of the last one. Whereas the last book was phenomenally undermined by Lewis's particular perspectives and agendas and ideologies, this one is so shorn of them that because that's all that sustains the Chronicles of Narnia, there's not much here. It's kind of dull. Prince Caspian is an odd one. It's a direct sequel to The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe in that it deals with the Pevensey children, Edmund, Peter, Susan and Lucy, following their original sojourn to Narnia. And not just sojourn, but their life that they spent there. They actually lived a life there and then came back and now are having another life as children in the real world. And it's really quite... It's never dealt with. It's one of those weird things that's never really dealt with. I really want to write a series of short stories or books based on that concept, where rather than it being about the children going to the fantasy world, it's about them dealing with having to come back and having to live normal lives again, and what a complete job that must do, what a complete and utter trauma that must be for you psychologically. But that's not really dealt with. There's a little bit of stuff, there's a little bit of badinage between the kids, because they are kids again, where they sort of talk about how who would ever have ever believed that we were kings and queens of Narnia, and that's it. That's as far as it goes. It's almost like it was a game that they played over the summer, and now the summer's ended and they have to go back to school. It's kind of like that. It's almost nothing. It's not dealt with, and that's troubling. And I know, it's a children's book, but the thing is, there are children's books that deal with this stuff. His Dark Materials, which we'll be reviewing after the Narnia retrospective, deals with this stuff. Things like The Thief of Always by Clive Barker, aimed directly at children, deals with this stuff. Things like Alan Garner's work. Alan Garner's work deals with this stuff all the time. It's almost like Narnia and the events that happen there are almost not real. It's almost like they're a game that the kids play at particular points and then just almost forget. It's almost like they fade into insignificance, and that's kind of troubling because it makes them pointless. It renders them inert in the same way that just exclaiming, "And it was all a dream," and the children woke up at the end of the story would, It actually means that neither the characters nor the readers bear any responsibility for it. But this book is so odd because it's almost nothing. There's almost nothing here. When you look at the original BBC adaptation from the 1980s, what they did was they merged and collapsed both Prince Caspian and the Dawn Treader into two halves of the same season, because there's not enough narrative here to sustain an entire series like there was The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And later, like there will be with The Silver Chair, which is my favourite book in the series, by the way. And the book is kind of empty. It's kind of big and resonant and empty. There's nothing here. Because it doesn't deal with the questions it should probably deal with. Whilst Edmund, Peter, Susan and Lucy are just kind of in the real world at the moment, following their lives in Narnia. In Narnia, of course, because time moves differently, centuries have passed, and so the stories of Edmund, Peter, Susan and Lucy, the kings and queens of Cair Paravel and whatnot, have faded into obscurity. They become almost like fairy tales or myths that people tell their children. And even not even that, in some ways, they have become forgotten, and a new regime has taken over, and it never really goes into detail about how that happens or how the stories are suppressed, but you have this dynastic rule from a royal family, and the presiding king is a wicked tyrant by the name of Miraz, who apparently murdered his brother to take the throne, and bizarrely took his nephew, the murdered king's son, under his wing. And it's an odd thing, because you kind of immediately have to ask, why didn't Miraz just kill the boy as well? The boy is technically a direct threat to his lineage, so why didn't he just kill the boy as well? It's a slightly odd one. It's a slightly strange one, but there we go. And Miraz is just not much fun. He's not a very good villain. The reason being, before him, you have the White Witch, Jardis. Jardis is a great villain. I really like the White Witch in the previous story. She's really, really cool. Miraz is just a bit of a tyrant, and that's it. There's nothing else to him. He's kind of boring. He's kind of dull, and there are lots of missed opportunities with Miraz. Because one thing he does do, like the rest of his family, he takes great pains to suppress the stories of the dryads and the nymphs and the fauns and the talking beasts and the walking trees and Aslan. He takes great pains to suppress those. It's almost as though there is a governmental conspiracy to suppress them in Narnia so that no one talks of them. It's almost like a divine right of kings thing where he wants nothing, no narrative that can present a challenge to his rule, to his right to rule, and that's it. But there are lots of missed opportunities here. Like, Lewis could have made him a bit more rationalistic. Instead of making him more tyrannical, it would have been much more interesting and much more pertinent to Lewis's very particular ideologies and agenda if he'd made Miraz a rationalist, or much more of a sort of skeptical character who actively disbelieves in these stories and finds them to be childish or harmful or something. That would have made a lot of sense. Instead, it's just because he's a tyrant. It's just because he's a bit of a bastard and he wants to maintain his authority, and that's it. That's kind of it. He's one note. Miraz is one note. And I like the actor who plays him in the BBC adaptation because he captures him really perfectly. He is just this bombastic, snarling, like, evil king character. And that's it. That's it. And, of course, inevitably, Miraz does sire a son, and the son is born, and, of course, that means that Caspian is now a direct threat to his line, so he has to kill Caspian. But Caspian is actually aided by some of the old forces of Narnia, the gnomes and the dwarves and the dryads and whatnot. They kind of spirit him away, and they hide him in the secret places where they themselves have been in hiding, whilst Miraz and his forces hunt them down. And they eventually end up in Cair Paravel, like the ruins of Cair Paravel, where they find Susan's horn, the magic horn that was gifted to her by Aslan, that whenever it's blown, help will come. And, of course, they use it to summon the Pevensey children from the real world. Now, this is one of the first things in this story where you're like, hang on, what? Why? Why the Pevensey children? I mean, they were never that much of a muchness in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The only reason they won through against Jardis, the White Witch, is because they had a lot of help, and I mean a lot of help from Aslan and the magical beasties that he leads. If they'd come up against her on their own, she'd have murdered them. They would have been turned to stone in the blink of an eye, and that would have been the end of it. So the notion of help taking the form of these children when Aslan is around. Aslan is around in this story. He's evident throughout. He turns up at various points and is capricious and as mercurial as he is in all the other books. There's a sequence where Edmund, Peter, Susan and Lucy are trying to find where Prince Caspian is. They're trying to find the place where he called them from, and Aslan kind of guides them, but not really. Instead of just saying, oh, it's over there, he just keeps appearing only to Lucy, and only in these vaguest terms. And because none of the others can see him, they don't really believe her, so they end up walking into danger. And that happens a couple of times, and you have to stop and just think, why don't you just tell them, Aslan? Why don't you just appear to all of them? This is just pointless and capricious. There's no reason for it, as there often isn't for Aslan's movements, you know? He's an odd character and comes off as really dickish. To an adult eye, it comes off as just completely and profoundly dickish, given that he is omnipotent. In fact, Aslan can just shake his mane and make everything go away. Nobody has to die, nobody has to suffer, nothing has to be bad in this universe or in this world. But Aslan just chooses to let it be that way, you know? It's a really capricious thing, and he gets more capricious as the stories go on. In this one, it's like, well, just let them all see you, Aslan, and talk to them, rather than just being this vague, mysterious asshole for the sake of it. You know, it's a really strange thing. It doesn't make a great deal of sense. It is just mystery for the sake of mystery and tension for the sake of tension. And I imagine it may have been a way of Lewis elongating the story, because there's so little here. There's so little that matches up to the dynamism of The Magician's Nephew, where you and the characters are still figuring out the mythology of this world and of the world surrounding it, or The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where everything hurtles along at a breakneck pace because there's stuff happening all the time. Even The Horse and His Boy, for all of its problems, is never boring. It's never boring. It's racist as fuck, but it's never boring. It hurtles along. This one, there's a lot of just standing around. There's a lot of navel gazing. There's a lot of characters talking about this and about that and about doing this and about doing that, and not actually doing a great deal. One of the most interesting things that ironically doesn't happen, it starts to happen and then is stopped very quickly, which would have been a great way to take the story. There are some of the fantastical creatures left that are from the witches' forces and not from Aslan's. There are still some hags and some werewolves left, and they are with Caspian, and they come up with the idea of using a ritual to call up the ghost of the White Witch to fight with them against Miraz. And that could have been a really cool way of taking it, but it never happens. Edmund, Peter, Susan, and Lucy burst in and stop it from happening. And that's that. It's such a shame, because the White Witch is such a much more interesting, dynamic, and threatening villain than Miraz is. Miraz is just kind of bleh, really. Miraz is just kind of boring. He's your evil tyrant. He's your evil fantasy tyrant archetype. Brother of the king, kills his own brother to assume the throne, sets about killing his nephew to legitimize his rule. It's so tried and tested. He may as well have been the Grand Vizier as well, and he may as well be played by Ben Kingsley. You know, he's that kind of character. He's boring. He's dull, and that's kind of how it comes out. There's a little bit of a scuffle. There's a little bit of a war between Miraz's forces and the forces of old Narnia, if you like, and that's it. Caspian is crowned king, and that's basically it. Aslan does turn up at the end, when all the fighting is done, by the way, when people have been hurt and slain and harmed, and that's it. That's kind of it. It's a bit, yeah. At the end, Aslan tells Peter and Susan that they're too old to come back to Narnia, but that Edmund and Lucy will. And it's like, what? Why? What? That doesn't make any sense, Aslan. That's just... why? Again, it's just capricious. It's just capricious, and it's just something that occurs for the sake of it. There's no real reason for it, and it seems to be quite a dickish thing for Aslan to do. It's bizarre, because the story is so all the way through. It's so all the way through. It's this one note all the way through. Then you get these little odd blips where Aslan is being a dick to everyone, and that's about it. That's as far as it goes. It's definitely one of the lesser books in the Narnia canon, largely because it's a bit dull, not because it's particularly offensive. It's just a bit, so what? In fact, what it really is kind of a setup for the Dawn Treader, which is way more interesting. It's very flawed, but it's actually way more interesting and way more fun. And also for the Silver Chair, which for my money is the best in the entire series. I actually really like the Silver Chair. It still has a little bit of Lewis's agenda in it and a little bit of his ideology going on, but it's actually really quite good. It's really quite fun. I like the Silver Chair a lot, and it's the one I read the most when I was a kid. It's also the best of the BBC adaptations. Oh, one thing I will say, the BBC adaptation of Prince Caspian, despite the fact it has much less budget, clearly than The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, way better than the film. Way better than the big budget film that came out short in the aftermath of The Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. Way better. Way more successful. Kind of like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, highly theatrical, slightly heightened, and works quite well. It's a decent adaptation. If for nothing else, it is brief. It keeps the brevity, you know. It doesn't try to elongate things. It really doesn't try to shoehorn stuff in. like the film does, to make it longer, to make it more dramatic. Also, the kid who plays Caspian in the BBC adaptation is way better than that really boring guy who plays Caspian in the film. In the film, he's so one note, he's so boring. It just doesn't work. It's very charmless. It's very charmless. Whereas the BBC adaptation has a lot of innate charm to it because it's ropey and it's theatrical and it's slightly too big, and it works. It works really well for these stories. But yeah, Prince Caspian, it's one that you just sort of like breeze through as an entryway to the Dawn Treader. And the Dawn Treader, actually, I really like. I think it's an interesting story. We'll get onto that next time. So, when next we come back, ladies and gents, bye-bye!